Hello, friends, and welcome to this second webisode in a series sponsored by the good folks at Lucidchart. Each of these builds on material we've covered earlier. That is especially true of today's installment, so to get the most out of it, please view our introductory webinar and the previous webisode at the YouTube playlist set up by Lucidchart. Last time, we looked at an interesting set of techniques and guidelines for discovering processes bottom up. And part of the rationale for that is there are two main problems with starting top down, one of which is it's simply not easy for people who don't have a global view of the enterprise. You need them to be involved and engaged. So I suggested starting bottom up with granular, recognizable activities. Easier for most people. That is the subject of today's webisode, how to discover those activities. Then we looked at applying bottom-up techniques and guidelines to get to the big picture, our process landscape, and then suggested we continue top-down into further levels of detail. So I describe this as the arc of analysis that I use in many settings. Start with synthesis bottom-up, and carry on top down with analysis. So the first technique I want to look at is discovering activities in a facilitated session. And the backdrop for this is a consulting job I did many years ago at a telephone company, and I was describing to my wife over morning coffee at the beach, how am I going to get this point across? And I started explaining it and waving my arms and finally said, I really need a flip chart or a whiteboard. And Karen, being the brains of the operation, said, well, we got a lot of sand and driftwood here. Why don't you use that? So we did. This became the starting point for explaining one of the real problems with top-down approaches. And I'm going to illustrate it with this example from a telephone company I was at that had been directed by their regulator to radically improve their service provisioning processes, the processes by which they install, relocate, and disconnect service. So they dutifully went about discovering their main processes. They identified them in a top-down fashion. They were directed by their executives to achieve operational efficiency, which is a pretty bad thing to try and do when you haven't actually identified true processes. But all the teams carried on getting the maximum efficiency out of this area. For instance, facilities management put in place a batching of service orders that really increased the efficiency, but it led to many orders being delayed for almost a week while they were waiting for their batch to come up. So they optimized their processes independently, but globally made things worse. The regulator was not happy, and the customers were not happy. So I was on another assignment at the telephone company. They asked me to chip in and help them figure out what went wrong, and it was, based on my experience, pretty clear that what they had done is the classic error you see in starting top down, which was confusing organizational structure or functions with processes. So those 5 processes that they had identified actually corresponded one-to-one with boxes on the org chart. So they were absolutely not cross-functional processes. They were localized activities. That led to the phenomenon that Ellie Goldratt told us about years ago, which is local optimization yields global sub-optimization. So what we needed to do is discover the actual end-to-end processes, represented by this piece of driftwood that cuts across all the 5 functional areas. So we needed to discover the activities that made up the end-to-end processes, and for each one of them, the trigger that initiated it and the results that signified its completion. And we were able to do that once we decided how we were going to discover those activities. And this was my first use of bottom-up techniques, and it was pretty straightforward. We simply used a facilitated session. Essentially, we asked people what their activities were. We had a facilitated session with representatives from each of the 5 functions. We brainstormed 200 essential activities, strictly following the guideline to focus on what, not who or how, to keep us out of the weeds. Reduce that to 50 activities. Then, following the guidelines we learned earlier, sequenced those activities, analyzed the ratios, 1-to-1, 1-to-many, and so on, especially focusing on the 1-to-many and many-to-one connections, which signified a process boundary. And then identified and named the processes, refined the activities. So here's an example of what came out of that session. A set of activities linked 1-to-1 that formed the process to fulfill a movement service order, the triggering event that started it, the results that signified completion, and even the various cases. Maybe it was a residential service order, maybe small, medium business service order. And this, when we remove the background, we can see is a nice, clean scope model using the track framework, a great start for helping people think end to end. And then to illustrate the distinction between process and function, we started building our process summary chart, making sure to include external players such as the customer. It was a pretty successful undertaking eventually. Now, here's another technique that we used on a process architecture job, which was discovering activities from one-on-one interviews. And I'm doing a lot of that recently because whether it's virtual or in person, because of the time pressures, it's harder than ever to get people together into a session. So I get prepared with one-on-one interviews. And to achieve that, I'll start out by sending out an email introducing the session and its background and objectives. And then I let people know the interviews are not going to follow a scripted list. They'll be open-ended and driven in part what they want to tell me. And they'll cover 3 main topics. Tell me about the 5 to 10 activities that are central to your role. Tell me about your issues and objectives. And tell me about the environment, especially cultural or historical factors. And this is pretty effective. 10 or 12 interviews times 5 or 10 activities yields 50 or 100 or more activities. But the key here, in addition to focusing on essential activity, is don't follow a script. If the interviewee thinks you have a script, most of them are going to wonder, why didn't you just email it to me? You want this to be more conversational. You want to build a relationship. You want to have the opportunities to follow interesting avenues. Remember, my friend Matthew in Seattle always says the juicy stuff comes up in the one-on-one interviews. All right, third approach that we want to look at is a really interesting one where we used role or job descriptions. The assignment was building an enterprise-wide process architecture, non-invasively and on a tight budget. So not a lot of interviews, no facilitated sessions, and with a very aggressive time schedule. So working with 2 business analysts, we decided on a meet in the middle approach. Going top down, we used their knowledge and a generic model of mine to identify 7 process families in our business on a page diagram. And the reason you don't see active verb and noun naming here is these are process families, not individual processes. Then the other part of meet in the middle is bottom up. So we wanted to extend and validate these first cut process areas following the approaches we've looked at before. Identify essential activities, bucket them into the process areas, use the techniques we've learned earlier to link those into processes, and then name and refine those processes. But the question is, how are we going to discover those activities without sessions and limited interviews? This, we concluded, meant we needed to discover and use available resources. We did, and one of the most useful, maybe the most useful, was role profiles. Somebody we interviewed told us that HR had recently completed detailed profiles of every role or job in the organization. Now, there was a lot of verbiage. It wasn't always easy to figure out what was going on, but focusing on our guideline of trying to discover the what and leave the who, the how, the why, and the when to later, we could see that this role really had a couple of key activities. Everything else was why, the justification. So using this was really profitable. I had identified the activities for each role in a given department. Then we mapped or bucketed those activities to process areas. Then we linked those activities into end-to-end processes. And one of the beautiful things about this approach was because the activities that made up the process were also linked to the involved departments. This gave us all the information we needed to produce our process summary charts, showing the process and the departments or functions that were involved. So looking at this schematically, we built high-level process areas top-down. Then we identified essential activities using role profiles and other resources. We mapped those to the process areas, linked those activities into end-to-end processes, and also refined those process areas. Our original 7 became 10. So it was a pretty successful undertaking in discovering our process architecture. So overall, we've looked at the arc of analysis, starting with bottom up with detailed granular activities and building up to the big picture, and then carrying on top down. And bonus, in a future webisode, which will look at using concept models, we'll see how that is a fourth technique that can be used to help us discover our activities. So with that, I thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something useful. I hope you'll feel free to contact me with questions or comments, and I hope you'll be there for our next webisode. We're going to look at a methodology for process change that supports real change in agile timeframes. That will tie together a lot of the techniques from individual webisodes. Thanks again. See you next time.